You have exactly 3 seconds to get out of my courtroom before I throw you in a holding cell with her." The judge roared, his face flushed purple as he slammed his gavel down so hard the oak block splintered. "You think you know the law, old man?" The black man standing in the gallery didn't flinch. He slowly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his voice dangerously calm. "I don't just know the law, Your Honor, I write it." Judge Pendleton burst into a cruel, booming laugh, completely unaware that the quietly dressed man standing before him was about to end his entire career. The air inside the Oakhaven County Municipal Court was thick, tasting faintly of cheap floor wax, stale sweat, and generations-spanning despair. It was a suffocating Tuesday morning in late July, and the ancient air conditioning unit rattling in the window did nothing but push the hot, humid Georgia air in sluggish circles. For the people sitting on the hard, splintering wooden pews of the gallery, the physical discomfort was entirely secondary to the crushing anxiety that hung over the room. This was the domain of Judge Arthur Pendleton, a man who had ruled the 9th District with an iron fist and a heart of stone for nearly 2 decades. In the very back row, practically swallowed by the shadows of the poorly lit room, sat a man who appeared entirely unremarkable. He wore a frayed, elbow-patched tweed jacket despite the stifling heat, a faded blue button-down shirt with no tie, and scuffed brown loafers. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed but unremarkable, and his quiet, observant eyes were framed by wire-rimmed glasses. To anyone in the room, he was just another weary face, perhaps a grandfather waiting for a relative's name to be called, or an impoverished citizen bracing for the inevitable crush of the local justice system. But this man was Marcus Simmons. He was not a grieving grandfather, nor was he an uneducated defendant. Marcus Simmons was a graduate of the prestigious Georgetown University Law Center, a former federal civil rights prosecutor, and, for the past 4 years, the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Simmons had not come to Oakhaven County on official business. There was no motorcade, no police escort, and no press secretary buzzing around him. He had driven 3 hours in his personal, 10-year-old sedan, dressed deliberately to blend in with the working-class citizens of the county. For months, the Supreme Court's Judicial Oversight Committee had been quietly receiving alarming, anonymous letters about Judge Arthur Pendleton. The complaints painted a horrifying picture of a courtroom run like a feudal estate, a place where due process was a joke, constitutional rights were routinely trampled, and marginalized citizens were squeezed for fines they couldn't pay, only to be thrown into the county jail when their pockets were finally empty. Simmons, a man who had dedicated his entire life to the sanctity of the law and the protection of the vulnerable, decided that reading reports in his marble-floored office in the Capitol was no longer sufficient. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to smell the fear in the room. And as he sat in the suffocating heat of Pendleton's courtroom for 3 hours, watching case after case, Simmons felt a cold, righteous anger building in his chest. He watched as Pendleton, a corpulent man with a red, veiny face and a shock of thinning white hair, systematically dismantled the lives of the people who stood before him. Pendleton didn't just adjudicate, he humiliated. He mocked accents, rolled his eyes at tearful explanations, and handed out maximum fines for minor infractions with a cruel, satisfied smirk. The local public defender, an overworked and seemingly defeated young man, barely spoke, merely shuffling papers and advising his clients to take whatever draconian plea deal the judge offered. "Next case," shouted Bailiff Miller, a massive, imposing man whose uniform looked 2 sizes too small for his heavily muscled frame. He didn't speak to the gallery so much as bark at them, his hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon. Case number 44-092, State vs. Brianna Hayes. "Step up to the podium. Now." Simmons shifted in his seat, pulling a small, worn leather notebook from his breast pocket. He clicked his pen. He had watched Pendleton abuse 5 people already this morning. But as a young black woman made her way down the center aisle, her hands trembling so violently that the papers she held were shaking like leaves in the wind, Simmons leaned forward. The atmosphere in the room tightened. The true test of Pendleton's court was about to begin, and Simmons was ready to record every single constitutional violation. Brianna Hayes looked as though the weight of the entire world had been placed squarely on her slender shoulders. She was 28 years old, dressed in faded blue nursing scrubs that smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion. Dark circles, bruised and heavy, sat beneath her terrified brown eyes. She approached the wooden podium that separated the gallery from the well of the court, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges of the stand to steady herself. Judge Pendleton didn't even look up from his paperwork as she approached. He let her stand there in agonizing silence for a full minute, a deliberate power play meant to make her feel small. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were flat and devoid of any human empathy. "Brianna Hayes," Pendleton droned, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have a bench warrant out for your arrest. Failure to appear on a driving with a suspended license charge, which stems from unpaid parking tickets. And now you're standing in my courtroom looking like a deer in the headlights. What do you have to say for yourself, girl?" "Your Honor," Brianna began, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat and tried again, desperate to maintain her composure. "Your Honor, I never received the notice to appear. The letters were sent to my old address, the apartment I had to leave because of my abusive ex-husband. I moved into a women's shelter for 3 months, and I'm just now getting back on my feet. I didn't know my license was suspended until I got pulled over for a busted taillight 2 days ago. Ignorance of the law is no excuse in my courtroom," Pendleton snapped, leaning forward. "People like you always have a sob story. Always an excuse. It's always someone else's fault, isn't it? The mailman, the ex-husband, the system. I'm sick of hearing it." "Please, Your Honor," Brianna begged, tears finally spilling over her lashes and tracking through the exhaustion on her cheeks. "I work double shifts at the elder care facility. I have 2 children, Leo and Maya. They are 6 and 4. I finally saved up enough to get us a small apartment. If you lock me up, I'll lose my job. If I lose my job, I lose the apartment. If I lose the apartment, the state will take my babies. I can pay the original parking tickets. I have $300 in my purse right now." In the back row, Marcus Simmons' pen stopped moving. The Supreme Court had established clear precedents regarding the criminalization of poverty. According to the landmark United States Supreme Court case Bearden v. Georgia, a judge cannot revoke probation or incarcerate an individual simply because they are genuinely unable to pay a fine. Before a judge can incarcerate someone for failure to pay, they must hold a hearing to determine if the failure to pay was willful or due to indigency. Pendleton was skipping every procedural safeguard guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. $300? Pendleton laughed, a wet, ugly sound that echoed off the peeling paint of the courtroom walls. "The original tickets were $300. The late fees are $500. The failure to appear penalty is $1,000. And because you've demonstrated a blatant disrespect for the authority of this court, I am setting your bail at $10,000, cash only." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. $10,000 for unpaid parking tickets and a suspended license. It was astronomical. It was illegal. It was a death sentence for Brianna's family. $10,000? Brianna whispered, her knees visibly buckling. She gripped the podium harder, sobbing openly now. "Your Honor, please. I don't have that. Nobody I know has that. You're taking my children away for a parking ticket. Please, I'm begging you." "Bailiff," Pendleton said lazily, waving a dismissive hand. "Take her into custody. Remand her to the county jail until she can post the bond. Next case." Bailiff Miller stepped forward, unclipping a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. He grabbed Brianna by the bicep, ignoring her terrified shrieks as she begged the judge to reconsider, begging anyone in the room to help her. The public defender stood a few feet away, staring at the floor, absolutely complicit in his silence. In the back row, Marcus Simmons closed his worn leather notebook. He slipped his pen into his pocket. The time for observation was over. The time for justice had arrived. The heavy oak pew groaned as Marcus Simmons stood up. The sound wasn't loud, but in a courtroom paralyzed by the tragedy unfolding at the front, it drew the eyes of several people in the gallery. Simmons didn't rush. He stepped out into the center aisle and began walking toward the well of the court. His posture, previously slouched to blend in, was now ramrod straight. He carried an aura of undeniable authority, an invisible weight that seemed to change the very air pressure in the room as he approached the wooden gate dividing the spectators from the legal arena. "Hold it right there, old man," Bailiff Miller barked, pausing his brutal handling of the sobbing Brianna. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at Simmons. "Step back behind the bar. Gallery spectators are not permitted to approach the bench. Sit down and keep your mouth shut, or you'll be joining her in holding." Simmons ignored the bailiff entirely. He stopped precisely at the wooden gate, resting his hands lightly on the swinging door. He looked past the aggressive deputy and locked his calm, piercing eyes directly onto Judge Pendleton. "Your Honor," Simmons said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that projected effortlessly to every corner of the room. It was a voice trained in the grand halls of appellate courts, a voice used to commanding the attention of the sharpest legal minds in the country. "If it pleases the court, I would like to address the matter of Miss Hayes's bail." Pendleton, who had been reaching for his coffee mug, froze. He squinted at the man in the frayed tweed jacket. His face, already flushed with the power trip of destroying a young mother's life, darkened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. In his 20 years on the bench, no spectator had ever dared to interrupt his proceedings. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Pendleton demanded, his voice trembling with rage. "Are you a licensed attorney in the state of Georgia, sir?" "I am well versed in the laws of this state, Your Honor," Simmons replied evenly, refusing to break eye contact. "That's not what I asked you," Pendleton sneered, looking Simmons up and down, taking in the cheap clothes and the unkempt appearance. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. An uneducated, arrogant citizen who thought he could play lawyer. "Are you her attorney of record?" "I am not her attorney of record," Simmons answered, his tone remaining perfectly level. "However, as an officer of the court, I feel compelled to remind Your Honor of the binding precedent set forth in Bearden v. Georgia. Incarcerating an indigent defendant solely because she cannot afford to pay fines or bail, without conducting a proper indigency hearing, is a direct violation of the Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Furthermore, setting a $10,000 cash bond for a non-violent administrative misdemeanor is a blatant violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against excessive bail." The courtroom went dead silent. The public defender's jaw practically hit the floor. Brianna, still held by the bailiff, sniffled, staring at the strange man who was throwing legal doctrine at the most feared judge in the county. Pendleton's face cycled through shock, confusion, and finally settled on a deep, malicious amusement. He leaned back in his high leather chair, interlacing his fingers over his stomach. He looked at the prosecutor, a slick-haired man named Vance, and offered a theatrical, mocking smile. Well, Pendleton chuckled darkly. "Looks like we have ourselves a sovereign citizen, Mr. Vance. A regular jailhouse lawyer who watched a few too many episodes of Law and Order, and thinks he can waltz into my courtroom and lecture me on constitutional law." "It certainly appears that way, Judge," the prosecutor snickered, leaning against his table. "I am not giving you a lecture, Mr. Pendleton," Simmons said, intentionally dropping the Your Honor title. It was a subtle shift, but to anyone who understood court etiquette, it was the ultimate sign of disrespect. "I am giving you an opportunity to correct a gross miscarriage of justice before this situation escalates beyond your control. Release Miss Hayes on her own recognizance, schedule an indigency hearing, and allow her to return to her children." Pendleton's amusement vanished instantly. The veins in his neck bulged. The fact that this ragged-looking black man had just dropped his title in his own courtroom was an insult he could not stomach. "Mr. Pendleton?" the judge roared, slamming his gavel. "You listen to me. You arrogant piece of trash. I am the law in Oak Haven County. You don't come into my house and tell me how to run my docket, bailiff. Detain this man immediately." Simmons didn't move. He stood perfectly still as Bailiff Miller unhanded Brianna and began marching toward the wooden gate, his hand reaching for his handcuffs. The confrontation had reached its boiling point. The heavy wooden gate swung open violently as Bailiff Miller shoved his way through, his massive frame towering over Marcus Simmons. Miller's face was red with exertion and second-hand rage on behalf of the judge. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Miller growled, grabbing Simmons roughly by the shoulder of his tweed jacket. Simmons did not resist. He possessed the profound, unshakable calm of a man who held all the cards, though the rest of the room believed he was holding nothing but a losing hand. He slowly turned around, allowing the bailiff to wrench his arms backward. As the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked and tightened around his wrists, biting slightly into his skin, a chorus of laughter erupted from the front of the courtroom. Judge Pendleton was laughing. It wasn't just a chuckle, it was a deep, belly-shaking roar of absolute arrogance. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. The prosecutor joined in, shaking his head at the sheer stupidity of the man in the tweed jacket. Even the court reporter, a cynical woman who had seen years of Pendleton's abuse, hid a smirk behind her hand. "You thought you were a hero, didn't you?" Pendleton mocked, leaning over his elevated bench to look down at the handcuffed man. "You thought you were going to ride in here, quote a few Supreme Court cases you found on Wikipedia, and save the day. How's that working out for you, counselor?" Brianna Hayes watched from the defense table, her heart shattering. This brave stranger had tried to help her, and now he was being thrown in a cage right alongside her. "Please, Judge," she cried out, "leave him alone. He didn't do anything. I'll go to jail, just let him go." "Shut up," Pendleton snapped at her. He turned his attention back to Simmons. "Since you like legal definitions so much, let me give you a new one. Direct criminal contempt of court. That's what I'm charging you with. And because you decided to disrespect my authority, question my jurisprudence, and disrupt my courtroom, I am sentencing you to 30 days in the Oak Haven County Jail. No bail. You can spend the next month giving legal advice to the local meth dealers." Simmons stood quietly, his hands cuffed behind his back. The metal was cold, a stark physical reminder of the power the state held over an individual. He looked up at Pendleton, his expression completely devoid of fear. "I will ask you one final time, Arthur Pendleton," Simmons said, his voice cutting through the remaining laughter like a razor blade. "Are you absolutely certain you want to finalize that order on the official court record? Because once those words are transcribed, there is no taking them back. You are sealing your own fate." Pendleton's laughter died abruptly. For a brief, fleeting second, a shadow of doubt flickered in the back of the judge's mind. The man in front of him wasn't acting like a sovereign citizen. Sovereign citizens yelled, screamed about maritime law, and fought the bailiffs. This man was completely at peace. He was speaking with a chilling, authoritative cadence. But Pendleton's ego, bloated by 2 decades of unchecked absolute power, quickly squashed the doubt. "I am absolutely certain," Pendleton sneered. "Madam Court Reporter, ensure the record reflects my order. 30 days for contempt. Bailiff, get him out of my sight and process him. I want him in a jumpsuit by noon." "Yes, Your Honor," Miller said, grabbing Simmons by the bicep to push him toward the side door that led to the holding cells. "Wait," Simmons said softly, stopping his forward momentum and planting his feet. He looked over his shoulder at the bailiff. "Before you march me back there, Deputy Miller, I suggest you reach into the inner left breast pocket of my jacket." Miller frowned, looking toward the judge for guidance. "What is this, a trick?" Pendleton demanded. "Search him, Miller. Make sure he doesn't have a weapon." "I am unarmed," Simmons stated calmly. "But what is in my pocket is going to change the trajectory of everyone's life in this room. I suggest you retrieve it, Deputy." Miller grunted, roughly patting down the left side of Simmons' jacket. He felt a solid, rectangular object. Muttering under his breath, the large bailiff reached inside the frayed tweed jacket and pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. "Open it," Simmons commanded softly. It wasn't a request, it was an order given by a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Miller flipped the leather wallet open. Bailiff Miller stared down at the open wallet in his massive, calloused hands. The courtroom was silent, save for the rhythmic humming of the struggling air conditioner and the soft, muffled sobs of Brianna Hayes. Inside the black leather wallet was a heavy, gleaming badge, cast in solid gold and surrounded by intricate state enamel work. It was not a police badge. It was not a sheriff's star. Positioned securely next to the gold seal was a thick, laminated identification card bearing the Great Seal of the state. Miller's eyes traced the bold, capitalized letters printed on the card. Marcus Simmons, Chief Justice, State Supreme Court. The blood drained from Deputy Miller's face so rapidly he looked as though he might faint. His mouth fell open, his jaw working uselessly as his brain struggled to process the impossible reality in front of him. He was currently holding the highest-ranking judicial official in the entire state in handcuffs. He had just manhandled the Chief Justice. What? What is this? Miller stammered, his voice suddenly sounding very small and terribly afraid. He looked from the ID to the man in the worn tweed jacket, suddenly noticing the sharp intellect in the older man's eyes, the regal posture that he had mistaken for arrogance. What's the holdup, Miller? Judge Pendleton snapped from the bench, growing impatient. Did you find contraband? I said get him out of my courtroom. Miller didn't move, his hands began to shake violently. Judge, he croaked, turning slowly toward the bench. He held the open wallet out in front of him as if it were an explosive device. Judge, you need to see this. Bring it here, Pendleton huffed, rolling his eyes. He snatched his reading glasses from his desk and shoved them onto his face. Miller walked to the bench, his boots feeling like they were made of lead. He handed the wallet up to the judge. Pendleton snatched it with a scowl. He looked down. For 5 agonizing seconds, the universe inside the 9th District Municipal Court simply stopped. Judge Arthur Pendleton stared at the gold seal. He read the name, he read the title. He looked at the photograph on the ID, and then he looked down at the man standing in handcuffs in the well of his court. The transformation in Pendleton was terrifying to witness. The smug, flushed redness of his face vanished, replaced by an ashen, sickly gray. A cold sweat instantly broke out across his forehead. The gavel, which he had been casually spinning in his left hand, slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the desk. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened as 20 years of corrupt, unchecked power suddenly collided head-on with an immovable wall of ultimate accountability. J. Justice Simmons? Pendleton whispered, his voice cracking like a terrified child's. The microphone on his desk picked up the terrified whisper and broadcast it through the courtroom. The public defender gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. The slick prosecutor dropped his pen, his eyes widening in absolute horror. The gallery erupted into a chaotic murmur of shock. Remove these handcuffs, Deputy Miller, Simmons said, his voice no longer the quiet tone of a spectator, but the booming, authoritative voice of the Chief Justice. Right now. Miller scrambled over himself, fumbling wildly with his keys. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the key into the slot. With a loud click, the heavy steel cuffs fell away. Simmons slowly rubbed his wrists, bringing his hands around to the front. He adjusted his jacket, smoothed his collar, and looked up at the broken, trembling man sitting on the bench. Judge Pendleton, Simmons said, his voice echoing off the walls, laced with a fury that was entirely cold and professional. Under Article 6, Section 2 of the state constitution, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court possesses direct supervisory jurisdiction over all inferior courts and judicial officers in this state. Pendleton opened his mouth, trying to find words, trying to formulate an apology, an excuse, a plea. Your Honor, I didn't know. If I had known who you were. That is exactly the point, Arthur. Simmons cut him off, his voice striking like a whip. You didn't know who I was. You thought I was just an ordinary citizen. You thought I was someone who lacked the education, the wealth, or the power to fight back against your tyranny. You treated me exactly the way you treat the citizens of this county every single day. You laughed at the law. You laughed at the Constitution. And you laughed at the destruction of a mother's life. Simmons took a step closer to the bench. Your court is a disgrace to the justice system. You use your gavel not as an instrument of equity, but as a weapon of extortion. You willfully violate Bearden v. Georgia, you flagrantly disregard the Eighth Amendment, and you strip citizens of their dignity for your own sadistic amusement. Please, Chief Justice, Pendleton begged, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. The tyrant had been dethroned, and he was terrified. I have served this county for 20 years. I can explain the bail schedule. It's standard practice for. Do not insult my intelligence by attempting to justify your corruption, Simmons thundered. He turned to the bewildered bailiff. Deputy Miller, release Miss Hayes immediately. Miller practically sprinted to Brianna, unlocking her cuffs in a fraction of a second. Brianna fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, wrapping her arms around her chest. The nightmare was suddenly, miraculously over. Simmons turned his attention back to the bench. Arthur Pendleton, step down from that chair. You are no longer presiding over this courtroom. You can't just remove me, Pendleton stammered, grasping desperately at the last shreds of his authority. I am an elected official. Only the Judicial Board. The Judicial Qualifications Commission began an emergency session 20 minutes ago at my direct request, Simmons stated coldly, pulling a cell phone from his pocket. I initiated the process the moment you set a $10,000 cash bail for a suspended license. Furthermore, as Chief Justice, I am exercising my emergency authority to suspend you from the bench, with pay, pending the outcome of the formal ethics investigation. However, your problems are much larger than the ethics board. Simmons pointed a finger directly at Pendleton's chest. For months, my office, in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has been investigating a kickback scheme between local judges and the private probation companies operating in this district. We have the financial records, Arthur. We know about the kickbacks you receive for every indigent defendant you assign to private probation, burying them in fees until they break. You aren't just facing the loss of your robe. You are facing a federal indictment under the RICO Act. Pendleton collapsed back into his chair, the remaining strength leaving his body. He buried his face in his hands, realizing that his life, his pension, his reputation, and his freedom were completely gone. The kingdom he had built on the backs of the poor had been burned to the ground in less than 10 minutes by the very man he had laughed at. Simmons turned away from the ruined judge and looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Vance. You have enabled this behavior. The State Bar will be investigating your conduct as well. But right now, you are going to approach the bench and formally file a motion to dismiss all charges against Brianna Hayes with prejudice. The slick prosecutor was sweating profusely. Yes, Your Honor. Immediately, Chief Justice. Simmons walked over to where Brianna was kneeling on the floor. He knelt down beside her, ignoring the dust on his trousers. The imposing, terrifying Chief Justice softened, his eyes filling with deep compassion. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Miss Hayes, Simmons said warmly. You are free to go. The bench warrant is quashed, the failure to appear is dismissed, and your original parking tickets have been voided by this court. Your children are safe. You are safe. I am deeply sorry that the system failed you so profoundly today, but I promise you, it will never happen in this county again. Brianna looked up at him, her eyes wide with reverence and disbelief. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around the Chief Justice's neck, weeping into his frayed tweed jacket. Simmons patted her back gently, allowing the young mother to release her terror. When he finally stood up, Marcus Simmons addressed the completely silent gallery. This court is in recess, he declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Justice will return to Oak Haven County tomorrow. As Simmons walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a shattered tyrant and a restored mother, nobody laughed. They simply watched in awe, as true justice finally left the building. If you loved seeing this arrogant, corrupt judge get exactly what he deserved, hit that like button right now. There is nothing more satisfying than watching a bully abuse their power, only to realize they picked a fight with the absolute highest authority in the land. Chief Justice Simmons proved that true power doesn't need a fancy suit or a loud voice, it just needs the truth and the law. We love bringing you these intense stories of hard karma and ultimate justice. If you want more dramatic stories with massive twists where the bad guys get taken down and the innocent are saved, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell.